There was a time when watching anime felt like stepping into a promise, not a guarantee, not a contract, just a quiet understanding between you and the story unfolding on screen. The understanding that no matter how dark things became, no matter how impossible the odds, there was a path forward. There was always a way to get stronger, to believe harder, to reach just a little further than you did yesterday. Hope wasn't a theme in those stories. It was the architecture, the foundation every conflict was built upon. You could feel it in the way protagonists stood back up after being knocked down, in the way their eyes burned with something unbreakable even when their bodies failed them, in the certainty that friendship was armor, that willpower could reshape reality, that the right words at the right moment could pierce through any despair. Watch Naruto climb from orphan to hero. Watch Luffy laugh in the face of emperors. Watch Goku surpass gods through nothing but relentless joy and the belief that limits are just invitations. These weren't just characters, they were blueprints for endurance. They taught an entire generation that suffering was temporary, that pain had purpose, that the world would bend if you refused to break. Somewhere along the way, that promise started to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like frost spreading across glass. The new stories that rose to prominence carried a different weight, a different truth. They still had protagonists who fought and bled and screamed into the void, but when the camera pulled back, the void was screaming back. The shift didn't announce itself, it crept in through the margins, through the way victory started feeling hollow, through the normalization of loss that couldn't be recovered from, through protagonists who survived rather than conquered, who endured rather than overcame. Modern anime stopped promising that everything would be okay. Instead, it started asking a quieter, more dangerous question: what if it won't be? Think about the boy who wanted to save everyone. In the older stories, that desire was noble, achievable, even. The hero's journey was a straight line from powerlessness to triumph. You trained, you suffered, you grew, you won. The narrative rewarded your conviction. It validated your refusal to give up. Now think about Eren Yaja watching his mother devoured in the first episode of Attack on Titan. Think about the way that trauma doesn't catalyze growth, it metastasizes. The way the story follows him from victim to soldier to something far more complicated and far more broken. There's no training arc that heals what he saw. No friendship speech that resets his psyche. The wound stays open. It changes shape. It changes him. Until the boy who wanted to save everyone becomes the man willing to destroy the world. This isn't a villain origin story. It's a case study in what happens when hope is systematically dismantled by reality. The older generation of shonen operated on a kind of moral physics. Good and evil were distinct forces. You could feel the difference between them. Villains were redeemable or they were obstacles. Either way, they served the protagonist's ascension. They were narrative fuel. Defeating them meant something. It changed the world in measurable ways. But the new wave doesn't traffic in that clarity. Mahito in Jujutsu Kaisen doesn't exist to be defeated in a satisfying way. He exists to prove that some curses are born from humanity itself. That evil isn't an invasion from outside, it's a reflection of what we already are. When Yui breaks down after failing to save Junpei, the story doesn't offer him a power-up. It offers him silence. The kind of silence that says, you will carry this. There is no arc that makes this okay. Denji in Chainsaw Man dreams so small it's almost unbearable. He doesn't want to save the world. He wants to eat good food and touch a woman and feel like a person for 5 minutes. And even those tiny, heartbreaking dreams get weaponized against him. Every moment of warmth is a setup for cruelty. Every connection is a potential betrayal. The story doesn't punish him for hoping. It punishes him for existing in a world where hope is a liability. This is the tonal shift, not from light to dark, from certain to uncertain, from suffering with meaning to suffering as condition. The old shonen said, you will be tested, but you will emerge stronger. The new stories say, you will be tested, and the test never ends. There's something hypnotic about that honesty, something that feels more real than the fantasies we grew up with. Because if we're being truthful with ourselves, the world doesn't operate on narrative logic. It doesn't care about your resolve. It doesn't reward you for refusing to quit. Sometimes you fight with everything you have and still lose. Sometimes the people you love die senselessly. Sometimes the suffering is random and permanent and utterly devoid of meaning. Modern anime is willing to say that out loud. It's willing to create protagonists who aren't chosen by destiny but trapped by circumstance. Subaru in Read Zero doesn't get stronger in any conventional sense. He gets more traumatized. Each death loop layers new psychological damage onto the foundation of who he used to be. The show doesn't glamorize his pain. It studies it. It forces you to sit with the reality that no amount of willpower erases the horror of dying over and over while everyone you love forgets it happened. The camera lingers on his breakdowns, on the moments where he can't speak, can't move, can't do anything but exist inside the architecture of his own trauma, and the story asks you to witness it, not as spectacle, as truth. This is what separates the old guard from the new. The old stories use suffering as a catalyst. The new stories use it as a lens. They are not interested in how pain makes you stronger. They are interested in how it changes you, how it stays with you, how it fragments your sense of self until you're not sure who you're becoming or whether that person is worth saving. Gabimru in Hell's Paradise is a hollow man trying to remember how to want something. David in Cyberpunk Edgerunners is a kid sprinting toward a cliff he can't see because the only alternative is standing still. These aren't heroes on a journey. They are people trying to survive stories that don't care whether they make it to the end. And maybe that's why they resonate. Maybe that's why this generation of viewers doesn't flinch when the protagonist dies halfway through, when the love interest is tortured for narrative impact, when the system the hero is fighting turns out to be unchangeable and they have to live inside it anyway, because we recognize it, not the supernatural elements, not the demons or the titans or the cursed energy, but the exhaustion, the sense that the world is structured against you, that trying your best might not be enough. That the gap between who you are and who you need to be is widening faster than you can grow. The economy doesn't care how hard you work. The algorithm doesn't care about your passion. The systems don't bend because you're good-hearted or determined or willing to suffer. They just are, immovable, indifferent, and you have to navigate them anyway. Modern anime stopped lying about that. It stopped pretending that conviction alone reshapes reality. Instead, it started building worlds where the protagonists have to reckon with the possibility that they might not win. That they might not even survive. And if they do, they might not recognize themselves on the other side. There's something darkly comforting in that acknowledgement, a strange relief in seeing your own uncertainty reflected back at you, in watching characters drown in the same existential weight you carry. It makes the fantasy feel paradoxically more grounded, more honest, like the story is finally willing to meet you where you actually are instead of where it thinks you should be. But comfort isn't the same as hope, and this is where the question sharpens. Where it stops being about tone and starts being about consequence. If we've moved from narratives of triumph to narratives of endurance, from stories about winning to stories about surviving, what are we teaching ourselves to expect from life? Is this evolution? A maturation of the medium into something more psychologically complex and emotionally authentic? Or is it surrender dressed up as sophistication? A generation so worn down by the world that we've mistaken despair for realism and hope for naivety? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the answer shifts depending on which story you're holding. Because here's what the discourse often misses: modern anime hasn't abandoned hope, it's just stopped making hope easy. Look closer at the stories we call dark. Beneath the brutality and the moral ambiguity and the unrelenting trauma, there's still something burning. It's just quieter now, more fragile, less certain of its own survival. Aaron's story ends in annihilation, but it begins with the desperate need to be free. That need drives every choice he makes, even the unforgivable ones. The tragedy isn't that he hoped, it's that the world he was born into made his hope monstrous. Denji gets chewed up by everyone around him, but he keeps reaching for warmth anyway. He keeps trying to feel human in a story designed to strip that humanity away. The fact that he fails more often than he succeeds doesn't make the reaching meaningless. It makes it devastating. And devastation is not the same as emptiness. Subaru breaks apart in every timeline, but he chooses to come back, over and over, knowing what it costs. He chooses to try again. That's not hopelessness. That's hope in its most raw, most painful form. Hope without the promise of reward. Hope as an act of defiance against a narrative that has given him every reason to quit. The new wave of anime isn't killing hope, it's stress testing it, asking what it looks like when it's not supported by destiny or protected by plot armor. When it has to exist in the same hostile conditions we do, when it's not a given but a choice you have to make every day knowing you might be wrong. And maybe that's the real shift, not from light to dark, not from optimism to despair, but from hope as destination to hope as practice. The old stories told us that if we believed hard enough, the world would change. The new stories suggest that the world might not change at all, and ask whether we can keep believing anyway. That's a harder sell, a more uncomfortable proposition. Because it removes the safety net. It takes away the narrative guarantee that your suffering will be rewarded, that your growth will be linear, that the arc of your story bends toward meaning. It makes hope voluntary, uncertain, terrifyingly free, which might be why it feels so real. Why it cuts deeper than the fantasies we were raised on. Because this is the hope we actually have access to, not the cosmic kind, not the guaranteed kind, just the stubborn, irrational refusal to let the weight of the world flatten you completely. There's a scene in Jujutsu Kaisen where Yui is told that he's not special, that he's weak, that nothing he does will matter in the grand scheme of things, and instead of unlocking some hidden power or receiving validation from a mentor, he just decides to keep going anyway, not because he believes he'll win, but because sitting still feels like dying. That's modern shonen in a single moment. The acknowledgement of your own insignificance followed by the decision to move forward anyway, to be kind anyway, to fight anyway, not because the story promises you'll succeed, but because the alternative is letting the darkness define you completely. It's quieter than what came before, less triumphant, but maybe more honest about what hope actually requires when the world stops cooperating with your narrative. Still, the question remains, the one that sits at the center of this shift and refuses to be solved cleanly. If anime is a mirror, and it is, whether we admit it or not, then what does this reflection tell us? What does it mean that we're drawn to stories where protagonists are broken before they begin? Where trauma is normalized and victory is uncertain and the systems of power are too vast to topple? Is it catharsis? The relief of seeing your own struggles externalized and validated? Or is it resignation? The slow acceptance that this is just how things are now? Maybe it's both. Maybe we watch characters endure the unendurable because it makes our own endurance feel less isolating, less pointless. Maybe we're drawn to the darkness because it's the first time fantasy has felt like it's telling the truth about what living actually costs. But there's a danger in that, too, a risk that if we spend too long marinating in narratives of inevitable suffering, we start to accept suffering as inevitable, that we mistake the depiction of broken systems for the endorsement of them. That we let the stories we consume shape our expectations until we stop believing that change is possible at all. Anime doesn't just reflect culture, it participates in it. It teaches us what to value, what to fear, what to accept, and if what it's teaching us now is that hope is naive and the world is hostile and survival is the best we can aspire to, then maybe we should ask ourselves whether that's the lesson we want to learn. Or maybe the lesson is more complex than that. Maybe modern anime isn't telling us to give up. It's telling us that hope in the 21st century looks different than it did before, that it's quieter, more personal, less certain of its own righteousness, that it has to coexist with the knowledge of how bad things can get, how bad they often are, and maybe that's not despair, maybe that's just growing up. The boy who wanted to save everyone is still here. He's just older now, more tired, more aware of the cost. He knows that some people can't be saved, that some wounds don't heal, that the world is more complicated and more cruel than he ever imagined. But he's still here, still trying, still reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The stories haven't stopped, they've just stopped pretending the ending is guaranteed. And in the space between that old certainty and this new fragility, something is still burning. Something that refuses to be named or pinned down or made safe. Something that looks like hope if you squint, or maybe just the memory of it. Or maybe the stubborn insistence that even memories are worth fighting for. So the question isn't whether modern anime has become too real. The question is whether reality has become too much like anime. Whether the darkness we see on screen is just a reflection of the darkness we're living through. Whether the stories have changed because we have. And if that's true, if anime really is a mirror, then maybe the answer isn't in the shows themselves. Maybe it's in what we choose to do after we finish watching. Whether we let the despair settle into our bones or whether we take the scraps of hope these stories still offer and build something from them. Whether we accept the world as it is or whether we fight to make it what it could be. The screen goes dark, the credits roll, the story ends, but you're still here, and that has to mean something. If anime mirrors us, if it holds up a reflection of who we've become in all our complexity and contradiction and bone-deep exhaustion, what does its darkness say about who we've become? And what does our continued watching say about who we still want to be?